Now we move on to Don Giovanni. Mozart's Marriage Figaro was such a huge hit in Prague, the year of its premiere in 1786, that impresarios in Prague asked him for another opera. They didn't care what the subject was, they just wanted more opera buffa from Mozart. So Mozart turned to Da Ponte, and they grabbed a libretto that was fairly readily at hand, or at least adapted one that was readily at hand, from an opera that had been composed the previous year on the Don Juan story, or the Don Giovanni story. So that's how this opera came about so quickly after the Marriage Figaro. So here, Mozart again, Da Ponte, the duo returns to attempt to recreate their success with Marriage Figaro. Now, unlike Marriage Figaro, which had a very well worked out, polished play as its basis, and that was an important foundation for the virtually perfect opera buffa that they were able to create from it. The Don Juan story does not have a well worked out play as its source. People had set Don Juan plays. There was a long, formal literary tradition going back to the great Spanish Baroque dramatist Tirso de Molina. He's the first one to have created a Don Juan story. Molière, the famous French playwright, had written one. Goldoni, a very important Italian playwright and very influential for the development of opera buffa in the 18th century, had done a version of Don Giovanni. And then, of course, as you'd see, there's Bertratti's version of Don Giovanni that was the same year as Mozart's. But the real source for the Don Juan myth comes from an informal tradition, that is, an improvised theater tradition. And the most important tradition of that was the Commedia dell'arte. Now, I've been talking about the Commedia dell'arte for a couple of lectures. Here's where we really see it in action. The Don Juan story was basically a shell of a plot that an improvisational group could take up and carry from town to town and adapt. And so here we have, again, show you some of the pictures, show you some of the characters from Marriage Figaro and Don Giovanni that correspond to the Commedia dell'arte types. Just to call an attention to a single example, there's a famous aria from Mozart's Don Giovanni that Leporello sings called the Catalog aria, where he reads a comically long list of names of conquests that Don Giovanni has seduced, women that he seduced. The Catalog aria, this was a stock feature of the Commedia dell'arte. They would show up in town and they would find out the names of some prominent citizens, maybe some business owners or a doctor or a lawyer, and they would put their names on the list, or at least they would say Mrs. So-and-so, implying that Don Giovanni had seduced their wives. So this is a ready-made joke that will fit anywhere, any place. So the Catalog aria is part of a long comic tradition. So let's look more specifically at the Don Juan myth. There's two components to it, very important. The one that most everyone associates is Don Juan is the seducer, the sexual libertine. And this is obviously very important. It's the first thing that pops into our mind when we think of Don Giovanni. But let's face it, it doesn't particularly distinguish this character from a lot of men. What distinguishes Don Juan and really drives the story and the conflict is Don Juan as the blasphemer, as the man who refuses to repent for his actions. It's not the man who sins. It's the man who refuses to repent, who refuses to recognize the authority of God. This is what brings him to his demise. So let's think about Don Giovanni, Mozart's Don Giovanni, in terms of typical opera buffa structure. You recall from the lecture on Marriage to Figaro, we have a first act first half where we, in this case it's the first act, where we lay out the conflict. Here there's a major conflict with a capital M and a capital C. That is, Don Giovanni kills the commendatore. Now the subplots that Da Ponte interjects to kind of help build momentum to a sort of a central conflict at the midpoint involve Donna Elvira and Serlina. Now these, of course, are supposed to lead to the maximum conflict, but I put a question mark here because the Act 1 finale is just frankly a letdown, especially when you compare it to the incredible Act 2 finale, The Marriage of Figaro. And the reason is that none of these subplots add up to anything that can match that opening conflict, Don Giovanni's attempted rape of Donna Anna and his murder of her father, the commendatore. That, you've already seen that, heard a comment, you should have by now already heard my commentary discussion of that. There's no balancing that. There's no subplot that can help raise the tension beyond that. That's hanging out there for the entire course of the opera. And this is not Da Ponte's problem or Mozart's problem. This is the problem with anybody that actually tries to create a drama based on the Don Giovanni myth, because that conflict will hang. It's laid out in its full power in the opening scenes, and it is not resolved until the end of the opera. Everything that occurs in the middle is just simply a string of seductions and attempted seductions. Different playwrights added more in. You can imagine the Commedia dell'arte troupe adding as many as they wished. They don't really make any difference for the essential plot. So one has a sense in the middle of Don Giovanni, in any Don Giovanni play, that you're sort of killing time, diverting the audience's attention with titillating seductions until you get to the real resolution. So the second half of Don Giovanni, I think, particularly suffers from this kind of meandering around, because none of these subplots are resolved, because none of them are particularly a conflict. Though there is some great music, I have to admit, especially that sextet. And then the final resolution. That is amazing. So Don Giovanni's reputation is really built on its opening scenes and its unforgettable concluding scenes. So there's going to be a discussion later, and you'll look at a couple of different versions of the ending. The opera essentially has Don Giovanni's is dragged into hell by the statue of the commendatore that returns to exact revenge, or to get just punishment, really. And then there's an epilogue that follows, where all the surviving characters come and sort of draw the moral to the story, and they also tell what they're going to do afterwards. This is a complete convention of opera buffa to finish up your finale with all the characters on stage, as we know. But many people have noticed, including Mozart himself in a second production of Vienna in 1789, that the epilogue really is a huge letdown and entirely unnecessary. That the opera is essentially over when Don Giovanni is dragged down to hell, and you can just simply stop it right there. And many productions do. But if you do drop the epilogue, which is a comic buffa convention, then what you're left with is, particularly with Mozart's music, a real tragic ending. And Don Giovanni has been transformed into a tragic hero. So I want you to think about this when you compare. There's a couple of different versions of the opera, two very different productions. The opera may be it may have more interpretations and settings than any opera I can imagine. The Think about this: how the effect is changed if you stop the opera right there at the very end of Don Giovanni's descent into hell, and when you watch it with the epilogue. Okay, I think I'll stop here and I'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about a specific number in the opera.